It's a real pleasure to be here. I know that our oblates are really important to us, and I can only assume that that is the case with the sisters as well. Um, I want to begin by asking you a question, and this will be our first experiment with using these mics at your tables. I just want to hear from 3 or 4 people. This is a way of kind of doing a little bit of work ourselves before I say anything. Um, I want to ask a couple of you, a few of you, maybe one of the sisters, and then 2 or 3 of the oblates. What's the point of being an oblate? Can I ask, if you're interested in answering that question for us, it doesn't have to be the perfect answer, it just has to be an answer. Would you raise your hand, and then when I point to you, you'll have to turn your mic on and then answer that question. The question is, what's the point of being an oblate? Or why are there even oblates? I know this isn't a shy group.
To me, being an oblate is being in service to the sisters.
It's to not only live the way Benedict lived in his vision, but also to share with others this way of living. And with the diminishing number of priest brothers and sisters, this is a way to get in the community and show through our actions how that life can be lived.
I think the point of being an oblate is to journey together in this life, to live this life together and to continue the formation of growing in relationship with God. And as you know, echoing what was said before, with numbers getting smaller, our life together can still continue to grow with our oblates by our side. And so I think that's very important, that we continue to grow in this life together.
I think for me, it's to be changed.
I joined the Oblates to continue my growth in spirituality, and because I don't know everything, with the Oblates at St. Benedict of Monastery Immaculate Conception, to learn and to give and receive from them, and to live the life of the rule of St. Benedict.
There were several important points that were made in the point of being an oblate. There was service to the sisters. There was an extension of what I'm going to call the Benedictine charism out into the world in general, but also in light of decreasing numbers. So there's service to the group, service to the church. Then there was a point of personal conversion to change, right? And to grow in spiritual depth. So let's keep those in mind. And I want to begin, we're going to talk about human formation. The topic that was given to me was, who am I? And I think I said to Shirley, I might need a little bit more direction. That's pretty broad. But it's actually a good question if we're thinking about human formation. So I want to try to address this question, who am I, in 2 ways. The first is to think about who am I in terms of who am I as a Christian adult. We're all adults in this room. And so it will have something to do with vocation, and will have something to do with oblation. And then the second thing that I want to, or the second approach that I want to take with this question of who am I, is the importance of being able to answer that question in order to be properly formed to engage in that vocation that we've chosen. It's a little bit complex, but we'll see. Now, in terms of our vocations, I remember when I was trying to discern mine, when I was about 20 some years old, I was in college. I knew that I had a religious vocation. I wasn't sure what. I had been to school with the Marianists, with the Christian Brothers. The diocesan bishop had said, you ought to think about being a priest. So it must have been written on my forehead that I had some kind of vocation. And I had the the theology of vocation that God had looked at me, and then he wrote down on an index card what he thought that I should be, and then he stuck it back in his breast pocket. And my goal in discernment was try to figure out what he had written on that card, because that was God's will. Until I talked with a vocation director for the Christian Brothers, who gave me one of the very best pieces of advice that I'd had, which he said, I'm not really sure that God is calling you just to be a Christian brother as much as I'd like for you to be. He said, I think that God can call us to lots of different things, because the same qualities in you that would make you a good Christian brother would also make you a good parent or a good spouse to somebody or a good monk or a good priest. And I found that very, very freeing. And I realized that really we have one primary vocation that we have to get right. One calling that we have to discern correctly, and that is to be the most Christ-like person that we can be. And this is the calling that we receive at our baptism. And if we think of these sort of sacraments of initiation, these are our first, we're initiated into this basic Christian call to be the most Christ-like person that we can be. God has made us in his image and likeness, and the degree to which we are converted, changed into Christ over the course of our lifetime, is the degree to which we are fulfilling that hope that God has placed in us by creating us in his image and likeness. On top of that, then, in adulthood, we end up choosing another vocation. If that's the sacraments of initiation, I think of these vocations as sort of the sacraments of fulfillment or fruition or flourishing, right? That we choose some particular way of life in which we continue to live out that basic call of becoming the most Christ-like person that we can be. We choose an other. We ally ourselves to a community or another person. And we expect that these are the people who are going to support us and challenge us in this project, this endeavor of trying to be the most Christ-like person that we can be. And then in each of our vocations, the beautiful thing is that we can go through life, if we're aware of this or not, referencing the other vocations and drawing witness from them. I think that I've learned the most about how to be a monk by watching my parents persevere in their 60 years of marriage, right? Sometimes we think that we monks, we sisters, priests, they have this mindset, my life is so different than everybody else's. It's really not. I mean, there are some real differences, right? But what it takes to persevere in the monastic life is an awful lot of what it takes to persevere in a marriage, right? The hardships, the challenges, the consolations, while some of them are particular, a lot of them are very similar, right? And so we have the ability to look to the other vocations for a particular witness that helps me to better understand what it is that I'm trying to do with my life as a Christian. I see that as a big part of what oblation is about, right? You're not here to be another sister. You're not here to say, okay, I've gotten marriage down. Now I'm going to take on another. I'm going to be a monk. I'm going to be a nun, right? But rather, part of your reason for being an oblate is to study the charism of the Benedictine life because you believe it has something to say to how you can better be a married person or better be a single person or better be a Christian in the world while still pursuing my primary vocation as a married person. We have oblates who are priests as well, so this is really one of the things that an oblate does is that he or she gets a closer look at, draws a closer witness because they believe that there's something in this Benedictine charism that can help me accomplish my primary vocation of being the most Christ-like person and perhaps even help me to be a better married person or single person or priest in the world, if that makes sense, right? So with that in mind, I think that Saint Benedict in his rule has basically mapped out the plan for all Christian vocations. This is Benedictine narcissism, meaning I think that Benedict has the answer for everybody. And I hope that you will agree with me on this. All the other religious communities, they take their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But I think they missed the boat. Benedict had the right formula. And so let's do a little study of Benedict's formula of the Christian life. Remember that the goal of the Christian life is what? To be the most Christ-like person that we can be. It's our primary vocation in the world, right? And then in order to do that, the monk or the nun, the sister, comes to the monastery and they promise to do three things. They promise obedience, they promise stability, and they promise something called conversatio morum. This is a review for you, right? This, you do know this. Okay, good. Now, I like to think of these three vows, these promises, and you make them according to your state of life as an oblate, but I like to think of these as a tripod, as a three-legged stand upon which sits this goal of conversion to Christ, right? We don't promise obedience because it's convenient. Oh, the monastery will just work so much better if someone's in charge and the rest of them obey him. I mean, that is true, but that's not the point of obedience, right? That each of these things do not exist for themselves or for some pragmatic reason other than because these three things are supposed to help us to become more like Christ, right? Obedience helps us to become more like Christ in a couple of ways. Number one, if I obey, and we can define obedience as listening, obedire means to listen for and to listen to the will of some other, right? So if I join myself to some others, I commit myself to them, and I lay down my life for them, this is what Christ does for us. He lays down his life, and it's not just when it's easy or the things that you like to do, right? John Mark, why don't you be the choir master? Okay, I like that. It's no problem being obedient there. John Mark, why don't you be the vocation director? What? No, 6 months ago, I said I would never want that job. Nonetheless, you got it. No, yes, okay, I'll do it. I'm handing my will over, right? And I really didn't want to do that. Sometimes I get overly dramatic. It's like it's killing me. But it does feel like sometimes when we say yes to something we don't want to do in service for someone else, a part of us is dying. I would rather do this, right? Rather than that. We have to give up our wills. We have to die some to ourselves. And the model for that, of course, is Christ. The degree to which we can lay down our lives for others causes us to be more Christ-like. But the other way that obedience causes us to grow in Christ-likeness is this. When you join yourself to a group of people, then these are the people who are going to get up in your face every day, and they're going to tell you how you need to change, right? We don't change when we live on our own with no attachments, right? But when we live closely with others and we've said we will listen to them, then these are the people who are going to say, your table manners are terrible. You need to chew with your mouth shut, right? Or you need to be nicer to the older members of your community, or you need to stop drinking, right? And so if you are serious about keeping this commitment to listen to obey these others and this abbot or this prioress, then you say yes and you change, right? Now, the thing is, there is stability. Now, this is a three-legged stand. All three legs are necessary. If you take one of them away, what happens to the stand? It collapses, right? So obedience requires stability. It's the partner. Because when someone asks me to change, my first impulse is to do what? To bolt, right? You need to be nicer to the old people in the community, older people, or you need to stop drinking. To which I say, well, you know what? I was just at Mount Angel last week, and they think I hung the moon. They get me. So bye-bye. I've always suspected that the monks at St. Meinrad were just a little dim. So I'm going to Mount Angel and they get it. And that's where I can be me and they'll love me, right? Except for 6 months after I go to Mount Angel, what happens? Yeah, you need to chew with your mouth shut, or you need to stop drinking, or you need to be nicer. Oh yeah, well, I've also been to St. John's. I should have known it. It's the Swiss American congregation that doesn't understand me. But if I go to St. John's, I'm German, American Cassinese, they'll get me, right? So I go there, and in 6 months, same thing. Because it's not the place that needs to change or the community that needs to change, right? It's the me that needs to change. So obedience partners with stability so that I don't run when the forces of change are prevailing upon me. Now, who do I make my promise of obedience to? An abbot, a prioress, but also the community and mutual obedience, right? That I'm not just going to do what the abbot asks me to do, but I'm going to lay down my life and do what this community needs me to do, right? And then there's one other thing, that there is a whom that I obey, but then there is also a what that I obey. And this is what conversatio morum is. Conversatio morum translates into conversion of manners, right? And a lot of people would say, well, that's just a vow that you're going to enter into a lifelong process of conversion, but it's more specific than that. The lifelong conversion is what's at the top of the tripod. Conversion of manners means that I'm going to change the way that I live, and I'm going to change it in a very specific way. It also gets translated into fidelity to the monastic way of life. And the most important word in that phrase is, you're going to say fidelity, but you're wrong. It's monastic. That I am, from this point on, on my profession day, I'm going to promise to be faithful to the monastic way of life, not the married way of life, the singled way of life, the celebrity way of life, my own selfish way of life, but I'm going to live the way that a monk or nun or sister lives, which means that I'm going to live in community. It means that I'm going to live the celibate life. It means that I'm going to live simplicity with everything held in common. It means I'm going to live according to the customs of this particular community, right? Because I believe that this particular way of life, if I'm faithful to it, if I'm obedient to it, will cause me to grow in holiness, in Christ-likeness, right? So it's obedience to a whom, in obedience to a what, and for how long? Stability, forever, right? And if you can stick with it, it will turn you into Christ. And it will be a real sign of the kingdom to come, right? Now, I hope that it occurs to you, this isn't really just a talk for the sisters here, for them to understand our vows. But when I say that I think that Benedict has the formula for every Christian, I hope it occurs to you that it's not just monks and sisters and nuns who take a vow of obedience. Because you also, if you're married, promise to love and obey the other person. I'm now going to join myself to another single person and be obedient to them. Not obedient and conform, comply, I am your, but rather I'm going to listen to and listen for the will of the other, my spouse, right? And it's mutual, right? I no longer, before I got married, I decided I'm going to live in Denver, because every young person wants to live in Denver for some reason. I'm going to live in Denver, and I'm going to have a boat, although that doesn't seem very practical in Denver, but anyway, I'm going to have a boat and a great car, and I'm going to hike every weekend until you get married. And then your wife says, or your husband says, I'm sorry, but my job is in St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis? Who went? I love St. Louis. That's where I'm from. But anyway, it's not Denver, right? And now we have a child. So you're dreaming about a boat, bye-bye, right? Your will, your goals, your dreams, your desires, your judgments are now secondary to this covenant that you've made. You need to listen now to the will of us, your spouse, your kids, right? And so there is an obedience to a spouse and the needs of your children. And then there is an obedience to the married way of life, right? I'm no longer going to live like a single person. I'm not going to go out with my friends every time I want to, right? I'm going to live the life that a married person lives from this point on. And how long are you going to do it for? Forever. Stability, because you believe, although people don't always realize, that if you do this forever, these are the people, this is the way of life that can cause you to be more Christ-like. Lay down your will, do what the other needs you to do. They'll do what you need them to do, right? And this is a sign of the kingdom. Just in the same way that the monastery is supposed to be a glimpse of the kingdom to come, every vocation adds its, as Pope Francis says, adds its ray of light to the kingdom, right? Gives a particular witness and helps to assemble the kingdom of God already here on earth. Does that make sense? And so I think every vocation promises obedience to some other. It's the other that changes. They promise obedience to a particular way of life, a priestly way of life, a married way of life, a consecrated way of life, a monastic way of life. And we promise to do it forever because we believe that this way of life and this group of people or this person is going to help me to be more and more like Christ, which is who I want to be and who I am, right? Conversion to Christ. Now, what does it mean to be Christ-like? It's nice to say, oh yeah, I want to be Christ-like. But he tells us to grow in our capacity to love, right? To love God, to love others as Christ does. This means to lay down your life as Christ does, right? It means to give yourself away as Christ does. And it means, interesting, if you're an oblate, what does oblate actually mean? Offering. Right? Yes, it means a lay affiliate of a particular charism, but an oblate also means one given to God or in service of God. Given, right? In other words, one who gives herself, one who gives himself away for others, for the church, right? It is to be an offering, a gift, to lay down one's life as a means of conversion to Christ. So let's stick with this idea that to be Christian is to be an oblate, an oblation is to be Christian, and it is to be a gift of self, right? No one has greater love than this than to lay down one's life for his friends. Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life, gives it over, will save it, right? As I have loved you, says Christ, so also you should love one another. And how has Christ loved you? By doing what? Yes, giving over his life. You want to be like Christ? Die. It's so radical, right? I mean, some people really die, but most of us are called to do this white martyrdom of dying to ourselves for the sake of someone else, to live an altruistic life, to do things for others without expecting something in return, out of love, right? To will for the good of the other person, right? Now, self-gift, this is the goal. Now, how do you prepare for such an awesome task in marriage, in the monastic life, if your vocation is priesthood? If we know that every vocation is about self-gift, then how does one know when he's ready or she's ready to embark upon that? And how does it happen? We're going to borrow a little page from Pastores Dabo Vobis. This is the document on priestly formation that Pope John Paul wrote, and it's where we actually get these pillars of formation. Pope John Paul said, well, in order to form priests, whose goal is also to turn into Christ, to lay down their lives, to get them ready, we have to think of forming them in 4 ways. There has to be some human formation, some intellectual formation. That's teach them theology, teach them the meaning of the life, teach them scripture. Then there is spiritual formation. We need to make sure that they know how to pray and have a good spiritual life. And then finally, there's pastoral formation. We need to teach them how to minister in the church. Interestingly, Pope Francis said for communities, then we need to give them communal formation. But the interesting thing is that Pope John Paul said that none of these matter until someone has had good human formation, right? That human formation is the basis. Do I have it here? Yes. The basis of all, he was writing for priests, but I think this extrapolates very well for us, that the human formation is the basis of all Christian formation. It's the basis of all married formation, of all monastic formation, right? That you cannot be a good married person until you're a good person, right? You are really not free to give yourself away to a spouse until you have some of your stuff together, right? We've seen it happen where people get married too soon, right? Or people get married with too many issues and then they're really not free to give themselves to someone else, right? So the goal is, the basis, the foundation is, how do we put ourselves together well so that we can then give ourselves away? Thomas Aquinas says it when he says that grace builds on nature, meaning our spiritual lives. God's grace doesn't build in spite of who we are as humans, but he starts with our humanity, right? And builds on our humanity to do amazing godlike things. This is a wonderful line from Pastores Dabo Vobis, and I'm putting priest in little brackets because I think we can insert our own vocations into this. But he says a priest, and I think we could say a spouse, or a monk, must mold his personality or her personality in such a way that she becomes a bridge and not an obstacle to those encountering Christ. How interesting. Your human personality is supposed to be a bridge for other people to see Christ or to meet Christ. Now, we could spend a lot of time thinking about what that bridge looks like. It's probably easier to think about what the obstacle looks like. Have you ever met a priest or a monk, maybe a sister, whose personality was an obstacle to Christ, right? Because they were short-tempered, because they were stingy, because whatever the reason is, it's like, I can't see Christ through you, right? Our personalities are supposed to be a bridge to Christ, not an obstacle to Christ. Think about what that means. So we start with the foundation of human formation being well put together. Now, this is my favorite line. It was in the introduction. If I had to give $1 for every time I used this line, my monastery would be broke. The bishops have this line to say about human formation. They say that human formation happens in a threefold process of self-knowledge, self-acceptance, which they later changed to self-possession, and then self-gift. And the order is really, really important, that we really can't give ourselves away unless we really know and accept the truth of who we are. How do you know when someone's old enough to get married? You want to set an age on it? What's the proper age to marry? 15? 20? 27? 42? Oh, I got a this on 27. You can answer this and I'll repeat it for the people who, so you don't have to. Why do you say 27? Why maybe 27?
I guess in my mind, I was thinking 30. So 27 was close. I think it just takes some time for a person to know them. I got married too young. So, but I'm still married. But I realized I was way too young. I didn't know myself. I didn't know I was. So 27 would have been better. You just need some time to get to know yourself, to be able to give to one another.
Doris is right. We can't really put an age, 27, 30, but the idea is, does this person even know enough about who they are, what they want in life, before they invite someone in and start inserting their will into their identity, their personality, right? Because the goal of marriage, the goal of the monastic life, is to give yourself away, not to be in a power struggle with another person, right? And so from the day one, you're supposed to die to self, be obedient in the best of ways, listening for the will of the other and being open and willing to do what they need for you to do. This means from day one, you need to know what you are, who you are, what you want, and then have enough lightness of touch with it to say, but I love you so much that I'm willing to put it aside. But if you don't know what you want or who you are, it's really hard to do that, right? We end up in power struggles because we're trying to figure out what it is that we want, and it's just much harder, right? Now, let's unpack for a second this concept of self-gift, okay? What does self-gift look like concretely in your state of life? So those of us who are monastics, what does self-gift look like? I might say it's taking a job that I didn't necessarily want. I might say it is living with someone and putting up with someone who drives me nuts. That's self-gift, and not complaining all the time, right? It is taking someone's turn at dishes, even though they always try to get out of their dishes. Or I was just on dishes last week, right? But I'm going to say, okay, I'll do it, right? There are big gifts, there are little gifts, but it's all about giving yourself away. And what does self-gift look like in terms of the married and the family life? It's every day. I went to work one day before I joined the monastery, and I was a single person, clueless. In came Donna Gefeller. She was the head of our department. I said, "Oh, Donna, how was your weekend?" And she said, "Oh, it was great, but I'm exhausted because my 5-year-old was up all night throwing up." And I said, "How do you do it? Like, when you know you got to go to work in the next morning, and like, how do you get up and do all of that?" And she's like, "What do you mean? How do you do it?" She looked at me like I was crazy. You just do it, right? You give yourself away. It's motivated by love, right? This is loving obedience, but it's a gift of yourself, a dying to yourself. Gosh, I really want to sleep, but it doesn't matter, right? My child needs this, my spouse needs this, my family needs this. I want to live in Denver, but we got to stay here, right? So this is self-gift, right? And there are certain characteristics of this self-gift. First of all, it is stable and persevering. I don't promise to love and obey you until I get tired of it. I don't promise to love and obey until someone else who has better ideas comes along, right? It's not a provisional gift of self, it's a permanent, stable gift of self to a spouse, to children, to a religious community, right? Because if I stay, especially when it gets hard, then it's really going to cause me to lay down my life and be like Christ. So it's stable and persevering, and it's every vocation. I promise to love and obey till death do us part. Sadly, they took that out of the marriage vow. I think the Anglicans still have those exact words, but we promise to obey the will of the other for the rest of our lives, right? Or in my case, I promise obedience, stability, and conversatio morum. There it is. It's enduring, it's stable, it's persevering. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. It's in all of our formulae, right? So first of all, these promises of self-gift is supposed to be lifelong, obedience and stability for the point of conversion to Christ. Then the second characteristic of self-gift is that it is perfect. Now, not perfect in that you don't ever not do it. The one place I believe that the perfect is used in the Gospels is in this place, I think it's the Gospel of Matthew, where he says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And it has nothing to do with perfect adherence to a law or a rule or something like that. It's where Christ says, you have heard it said that you should love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say, love your enemy. And then he goes on, I mean, what good does it do to love your neighbor and hate your enemy? Even the tax collectors can do that, right? But God's rain falls on the just and the unjust, right? So the idea then, he says finally, so be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect means don't just love when it's easy. Don't just love the people that are easy. Don't just love the monks in your community, John Mark, who are easy to get along with. You need to love the guy who's all through mass going, right? You have to love the guy who's falling asleep in the office. You have to love the guy who gets on your every last nerve, right? Everybody, you have to love perfectly, not just when it's easy, not just the people that are easy. And if you're a spouse, you know what this means, right? You have to love this person, not just their good qualities, but you have to put up with their bad qualities. And you even have to stop trying to change them. Will a marriage work if you try to change every single thing you don't like about your spouse? Nor will monastic life. It's the first crisis of the novice and the junior. There are people here that make me mad. There are people here that scandalize me. And like, okay, and they're not going anywhere. And you should be thankful. That's maybe being a little bit too Pollyannish, but these are the people that are going to turn you into a saint. If you can love the difficult people, if you can love your spouse despite the fact that he does this or she does that, then you are growing in Christ's likeness. Because Christ doesn't lay his life down just for the already perfect or the people who deserve it, if anybody really did, but he lays down his life for everyone, not even those who don't even want or know him, right? This is what it means to be self-gift, to give oneself away perfectly at all times, not just when it's easy. And then finally, this gift of self has to be stable, it has to be perfect, and it has to be free. Now, what does this mean that we have to make a free gift of ourselves? It means, first of all, that it's not coerced. Someone's not forcing you to give yourself away. That's an obvious sense of free. But it also means that you're not going to give yourself away with some strings attached, right? I'll give myself away, sure, as long as I get the job that I want, or as long as she agrees to do this, right? Well, it's not fair. He doesn't have to do that, so why should I have to do that? That's a string. That's not a free gift of self, right? You give a gift to someone without any expectation of what they're going to give back to you. What if that worked in our families at Christmas time? I've got a really nice gift for you. Go ahead, open it. Yeah, isn't that amazing? A diamond ring. Now you get to keep it if I like the gift that you give me as well. It doesn't work that way, right? I freely give this to you and you can use it however you want. I give myself to this community and you can use me however you want. Great, we need a vocation director. Oh, not except for that. It's a string, right? I will marry you and I will love and obey you till death do us part, as long as there is no as long as. It's a free gift of self, right? I'm not going to take it back. And then the other way that a free gift of self means that we are actually free to give ourselves away, that we are not encumbered or limited by some internal factor, right? I know, and this is a bit what, and I forget what your name was again, Doris. This is what Doris, I think, was getting at, that you have to have enough of yourself, you have to have enough of your stuff together to really be in a place where you can give yourself to somebody else, right? You can't be wrought with insecurities, right? I'm going to get into this relationship because they'll make me feel more secure. That's not a good free choice, right? Or you're too naive, or you don't have a real sense of self. You need to know who you are and what you're bringing to this relationship, right? Or you can't be in such a state of emotional distress that you're really not free to give yourself away. Or that you have so much shame that you're bringing to this relationship that it's going to fall apart as soon as someone gets close to that, right? So, as we've said before, human formation happens in this threefold process of self-knowledge, self-acceptance, and self-gift. Doris said she had to know herself. It would be nice to know yourself, accept who you are, before you can really give yourself away, right? The new documents call this self-possession. I own, this is who I am, right? So let's think about these two things. How does one, before I do that, does anybody have any questions or comments or maybe an argument? I think this is a bunch of bunk. Anybody want to, I'll turn my mic off and you're about to ask a question or.
Family, like brothers and sisters, you haven't alluded to that, but I mean, that just makes perfect sense. I mean, I'm the oldest sister trying to tell my brother what to do all the time, and it's, and you can't, and that's one, I mean, you don't ever go into a marriage thinking divorce, but you can't get rid, you can't get rid of your siblings, so just saying. I love my brother. He wants to get rid of me, I would say.
Good. It's a good point that our families are good training grounds for this, right? That we grow up in our families learning, to give to the other person, to consider their needs, if we're lucky, right? If we've grown up in a family situation in which we've seen our parents sacrifice for one another, or if our parents have taught us this is sharing, or I know it's not fair. Sometimes it's not fair in your favor. Sometimes it's not fair in his. This times it's not fair in his. It's part of life, right? And so, yes, a family can be a great training ground for learning how to give ourselves away, right? Good. Any other comments or questions at this point? Okay, so let's think about this threefold process of self-knowledge, self-acceptance, or self-position, and self-gift. So we know what self-gift looks like. I've painted a beautiful, attractive picture of dying to yourself for others, but this is really what it means to be Christ-like. But before we can do this, in relationship to another person or group of people, we're not ready, we're not free to do that until we have adequate possession of ourselves, knowledge of ourselves, and acceptance of ourselves. How do we get to know who we are? How do we grow in self-knowledge? Well, it's obviously a lifelong process. I think this is the interesting thing, is that we say, well, you have to know yourself before you can give yourself away. But do we ever entirely know ourselves? No. And the fact is, we learn an awful lot about ourselves once we do give ourselves away, right? I think this is the interesting thing about Doris's point. I did get married pretty young. My guess is that she knew some things about herself, but boy, did she learn a lot more, right? Because when we attach ourselves to somebody else, or when we exist in a community, they start to tell us who we are as well, right? So this has a lot to do with identity, the sense of self-knowledge. Who am I? What's important to me? This is influenced in various stages of our life, first by our parents, right? If you think about it, until we're adolescents, who tells us who we are? Our parents, right? By telling us what our values should be, how we should spend our lives, how we should behave. You should think about doing this, right? This is what it means to be a Falkenhayn, or this is what it means to be a Smith, or this is what our family values. Our parents are our big formers of our identity until what happens? Adolescence is what happens. And what happens in adolescence? Well, people rebel. And now rebellion doesn't have to be this great antisocial sort of thing. But In adolescence, you start to what we psychologists call the process of separation and individuation. How fancy. Which means that when you're an adolescent, you start saying things like, do we have to go out Wednesday night to the pizza place again? Really, I really wanted to hang out with my friends tonight, but we always go out for pizza on Wednesday nights. That's our family thing. I know, and I'm so bored with it. I'm so over Wednesday night pizza. Um, I'd rather go, to the mall. People don't do that anymore, but anyway, with my friends. Right. They glom onto their friends as their little stepping stone away from their parents, right? And then they're like, your parents bring you something home, you're like, I'm not wearing that. Like, that's so lame. What would you like to wear? This is what people are wearing these days. And your parents are like, well, that's terrible. You should, that's the ugliest thing in the world. Yeah, well, I think your clothes are ugly. Maybe not that dramatic, but it is that dramatic. Adolescents start to separate, right? And they individuate because by the end of adolescence, they are supposed to do what? They're supposed to be an adult. They're supposed to actually have an identity of their own that is separate from, but also related to their parents, right? You never stop being related to your parents. It's really interesting. I've worked with lots of kind of adolescents, and every once in a while, parents will come in with their teenage daughter, their teenage son, and they'll be fighting over something. She doesn't trust me. Well, it's because you don't act trustworthy. Yeah, well, you never let me go. I want to go to this concert, and you won't let me go because you think that I'm going to get in a wreck. And they start, and so then the parent, let's say the father or the mother, will start to lecture. Yes, it's because, and then I'll stop the parent and I'll say, what is your mother about to say? Ask the teenager. She's about to say that this and this and this and this and this. And then I say, is that what you're about to say? And the parent says, yes. That's how it's supposed to work, right? It's not that teenagers forget what their parents want or what their parents' values are, right? They're all internalized if you've been a good parent. But inevitably, the teenager has to start doing what? Making some of their own choices. They say that the teenage years, adolescence is such like a big stormy time. It's not for the adolescent. It's stormy for the parents, right? Because you have to let go. You have to let this person make their own choices, knowing that some of them will be mistakes, right? But this is part of what it means to have an identity, right? You can't follow them around for the rest of their lives, making their choices for them. And you actually don't want that, right? You want them to become their own person. So interestingly, our identity is formed early on by our families of origin and our parents. But then in adolescence, our peers, right, start to form our identity, right? When I was in high school, I had to have an Izod shirt. It was the 1980s. I went to a fancy prep school. Everyone was wearing Izod shirts with the alligators, right? And so I had to have one of those because it's death to be different, right? And my parents came home, they're like, okay, and they went to Sears. Sears doesn't sell Izod. They sold shirts that looked just like Izod shirts, but it had a dragon on it with fire coming out of its mouth. Now, my parents didn't get it because they weren't 14 years old. And they're like, here you go. And now I love my parents. I really do. And I looked at the shirt and I thought, this is going to get me killed. So I said, thanks. And I took it up to my room and I thought, what am I going to do? So I thought a shirt with the wrong animal a shirt with no animal is better than a shirt with the wrong animal. So I started to peel the dragon off of the shirt, but they glue and stitch those things on good, right? And so I tore the shirt, a brand new shirt. And so then I came down a little bit later and I said to my parents, I ripped this shirt. I think they thought that I was crazy. Like, what have we raised here? So anyway, so I tried to explain to them, I got to fit in with my peers and nobody's wearing this shirt. Nobody has a shirt with a dragon, right? Now, this seems to an adult like this so stupid, but this means everything to an adolescent, right? Now, they said, okay, well, if you want one of those shirts, they're expensive, so we'll pay half and you pay half. right? You're not an adult yet, but you're in training. So you need to do your part here. So we learn what we want, we reference our peers in adolescence. Eventually, we don't just dress like our peers, but it's our stepping stone away so that we eventually have an identity. Who am I? Right? Self-knowledge of who I'm going to be that's separate from them. And oddly enough, when we get to be about 30, we're like, oh my gosh, I'm turning into my dad. All of his all of his bad jokes and all that kind of stuff. And then finally, as we grow into adulthood, it's our experiences, right? In our important relationships, our good friends, our spouses that continue to tell us kind of who we are, right? The things that we've experienced. And that all gets mixed up with who our the values and the ideas of what our parents have told us we are, what's important, what our peers and the culture say, and then what our own experience and the people we love tell us is important. So that in adulthood, we finally have this I am, right? This ego in the best sense, an identity that we know about ourselves, right? It includes our gifts and our limitations, right? Our attitudes and our values, our worldview, right? We don't have the exact same attitudes and values as our parents, right? We have different goals, different values, different attitudes, although we share some of them. And then the important experiences that we have, both positive and negative, become part of who we are, right? And then the relationships and the commitments we've made become part of our identity, how we understand and know ourselves, right? Now, it's interesting because other people teach us also who we are, right? We could sit and we could reflect, who am I? What do I like? What are my best characteristics? What are my limitations? Limitation? I just don't see any. We don't really know who we are until we put what we know about ourselves into dialogue with what other people think of us, right? You think you're funny, but what? I'm not funny? Yeah, in fact, it's really annoying. Every time things get serious, you try to make a joke and you think it's funny, but it's not funny, right? Maybe your spouse has told you that, or a community member tells you that, and you learn something about yourself. We need you to stop drinking. Man, you're really good at organizing. Have you ever thought about doing this? It's also a form where people tell us who we are, right? Now, this is going to be a theme that we have to be in a community, we have to be closely related to people to genuinely know ourselves. We're limited without others, right? And so others play an important role in our conversion, our understanding of ourselves, even calling us to better things, right? You're really good organized. Have you ever thought of doing this? You're a great teacher. Have you ever thought about helping out with PSR or whatever it is, right? Okay, so self-knowledge. Now, what's the difference between self-knowledge and self-acceptance? If you say something, I'll repeat it so you don't have to fight with that little microphone. Anybody want to venture what's the difference between self-knowledge and self-acceptance? Self-acceptance is knowing who you are and being okay with it. Okay, anybody else want to try to define it? I think that's right. Okay, so seeing your strengths, seeing your limitations, the good in you and the bad in you, and being able to accept that about yourself and hopefully change. Okay, good. So let's think about self-acceptance and self-possession. The bishops in their line, it used to be self-acknowledge, self-acceptance, self-gift, and then they changed it to self-possession. I think they changed that because I think people were getting maybe confused because self-acceptance is not the same thing as self-approval, right? Sometimes when we say, well, I really accept myself, it sounds like, like this is who I am, I'm fine, right? That's not exactly what self-acceptance is. That could be self-approval, right? But self-acceptance is to say, I have these gifts, I have these limitations, and I am able to live comfortably with them. It doesn't mean that I don't want to change, but I'm also not constantly putting myself down. I'm not hating myself because I'm not perfect, right? I can accept the truth of who I am, of what's happened to me, right? And so for most people, this includes some things that we struggle to accept about ourselves, right? I've always had a difficult time accepting the fact that I have a learning disability, or that I was sexually abused, or that I have this sexual orientation, or that my dad went to prison, or that whatever it is, right? All of us have what I call sort of centers of shame, things that we wish had been different about ourselves. And it's easy to accept the things we're good at, right? But it's a real chore. It's very difficult to accept and own and possess the things that we wish were different about ourselves, right? But we're really not free to give ourselves away until we can honestly say, this is who I'm giving, right? This is who I am. This is how I was made, or this is what has happened to me, and I can't undo it, right? Now, what's interesting is that self-acceptance, it's misnamed because it doesn't come from the self. Self-acceptance comes from other people, right? Because when we have some center of shame, something that we have a difficult time accepting about ourselves, our greatest fear is that if other people found this out, what? They won't like me. They'll reject me, right? I'll never find someone to love because they'll eventually find this out and they will reject me, right? So I can't accept this about myself. I can't live comfortably with who I am as long as I have this thing, right? Until what happens? Until you're close to someone and you really love them and you really respect them. And for the first time in your life, you take a big, deep breath in and you say, I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone before, that when I was a kid, this happened, or I have this learning disability, or whatever it is. And then you wait. And then the other person, if you're really blessed, says what? I'm glad you told me, but it doesn't change how I feel about you. I'm sorry that you've had to suffer with this, but I love you anyway, right? And so now you realize I could be accepted, right? There are some people and people that matter to me, or a person that matters to me. I don't have to, everybody doesn't have to accept this about me, but if someone or some people that I really love and care about can love me even with this, then I can accept myself with this too, right? So self-acceptance, it would be nice to think that we can wake up one day and say, you know, I'm going to be okay with this from this point on. But it involves other people, right? Self-knowledge involves other people. Self-acceptance involves other people. Now, here's the other thing about self-acceptance. This is one of my favorite ideas. I talk about this all the time. There's this book that I've only read one chapter from, I'm embarrassed to say. It's a book by Evelyn and James Whitehead called Seasons of Strength. It's from the 80s or 90s. It's got a real 90s sort of name. The chapter that I read even is very 90s, self-intimacy, whatever that means. But I read this chapter because I was looking for something on self-acceptance, and they said something that makes a ton of sense to me. They said, first of all, they begin with the idea, or they point out to us that we are plural, meaning that we are a mix of good and bad, right? We're a mix of gifts and a mix of limitations. We're a gift of personal strengths and things that we're not so good at. So we begin with this, which helps us to understand why one day we can feel so good about ourselves, and then half an hour later, we're like, I'm the worst person in the world, right? Because we can experience both of those within ourselves, right? But then they say that transformation, change, or conversion can only happen when we hold two seemingly opposite attitudes in place at the same time. First of all, we have to be able to hold the attitude of holy intolerance, by which they mean it's the part of ourselves that is always desiring to be better than we are, right? The ever-present desire to be better than we are. I wish that I could be better at being nice to these people. I wish I were not so impatient. I wish I were not, doing the sin over and over again. I wish I could not lose my temper every time I'm around my mother-in-law. Whatever it is, it's the part of us that will never be quite satisfied until we have changed things about ourselves that truly need to be changed. But we have to hold this in tension at the same time with a sense of self-acceptance as we currently are, a willingness to accept ourselves as good and lovable and loved, even when we haven't changed these things about ourselves, right? We can think of putting it up sort of like this, that we have to live between this tension of holy intolerance. I want to be better, I want to be better, I want to be better, but this is who I am. And I'm okay and lovable as I am, right? If we only had holy intolerance without an acceptance of self, what would that look like? It would look like perfectionism, right? I can never like myself until I am perfect. And that's actually a sin, right? Because then we're holding ourselves to a higher standard than God holds us to. He doesn't need for us to be perfect to love us, right? And so this is unholy intolerance, right? On the other hand, if we have just acceptance of ourself without any desire to be better, then we would never change either, right? And this would just be self-indulgent or maybe even narcissistic. I'm good with me. I don't care what other people need, what other people want, right? This person never grows. There's no internal desire to be better than she is or he is, right? So we have this, they're saying that if we're ever going to grow, to be transformed, to be converted, we have to have both of these impulses or these attitudes within ourselves. Now, I think we should revisit Benedict. I think this is basically humility, right? Have you ever read Michael Casey's book on humility? It's called Living in the Truth. And his whole idea is that humility isn't saying, oh, I'm no good at that. Oh, I'm just a worm and no man. Oh, yeah, I know that you think that I'm a great musician, but really I'm not. Like, that's not humility. Humility, that's dishonesty, right? But for Michael Casey, humility is about living in the radical truth of who we are, right? I'm good at this, but I'm not very good at that, right? And they can coexist within me, right? It's having self-knowledge and self-possession about myself. Now, humility is an incredibly attractive quality in people. My model for humility is a woman that I worked with before I joined the monastery. Her name was Jane Cross. She was a psychologist in St. Louis. She was kind of the grande dame of our department. She was in her 60s. She had been a psychologist forever. She was so comfortable in her skin. A brilliant woman. She had been the very first person accepted to the clinical psych doctoral program at Columbia University back in the 50s or whatever it was. Super, super smart, but never came off as difficult to relate to. But she was so comfortable with who she was. She could tell you what she's good at. She could tell you what she's bad at. She was having guests over for dinner one night. I said, are you a good cook? And she said, I'm an excellent cook, but I'm a total slob of a housekeeper. So John has to get the house ready for people to come over to taste my cooking. Now, she was also very good even as our department head. If we were having a meeting and someone would say, let's give that depression case to John. And she'd say, no, he's terrible with those cases. Give that to Mike. He's better with those. He's better at these cases. And nobody would ever be offended because it's all good, right? You're good at this. I'm good at that. I'm not good at this. You're not good at that. And this was such an attractive quality in her that Jane was interesting. She always had either a stain on her dress or a run in her stocking, or sometimes her lipstick would sort of wander. But she was somehow the most attractive person in the room because she was so at ease with herself, right? There was this inner beauty that really kind of emanated for her. So this humility, I want to be better. I'm not there yet. I can accept that, but I still have a drive to be better than I am. And I'm okay with this is a real sense of humility, right? A self-knowledge, I possess who I am, I'm going to share who I am, right? And when we meet these people, it really results in, I don't know if you ever met these people, but they're almost forgetful of themselves. they're no longer trying to impress other people. You ever notice that? They're really at ease. They're not trying to get their agenda done, and they are truly present to other people because they become sort of transparent. They facilitate relationships. They make you feel good about yourself. Now, what I think is really interesting is that if this is humility, in St. Benedict's rule, humility is one of the anchors. But one of the other anchors is what? Hospitality. And I think it's because hospitality is really the extroverted version of humility, right? That if I can accept myself as a mix of things and be comfortable with that and then forget myself, I can then be interested in other people and accept them for who they are. Does that make sense? And so we become more generous with ourselves because we're not still trying to impress, still trying to apologize for who we are. We know what our gifts are, we know what our limitations are, and I'm going to give that to you, and I'm going to welcome you for who you are, right? It's generosity with oneself, which is really self-gift, which is what we've been talking about this whole time, right? And it answers that little line in Benedict's chapter on hospitality that all guests are to be welcomed as Christ. And the most important word in that phrase is all, not just the beautiful guests, not just the guests that are nicely groomed and smell nice because they bathed this morning, or not just the guests who have the same political beliefs that I do, or not the guests that, right, but all of them, even the difficult ones, I can welcome, right? But I have to be fine with my own difficulties. I have to know, possess who I am, leave it behind, and now be welcoming to people in all of their plurality, in their incompleteness. If God can love them, if God can love me, and I can know that, then I can love this person, right? Humility and hospitality. Any comments or questions before we begin to wrap up? Any arguments or any clarifications needed? Oh, okay. So Shirley said, I love that scripture passage about the sheep and the goats. I'm gonna divide you into the sheep and the goats, right? And gosh, I hope I'm a sheep. Or are the goats good? I think sheep are the good one. But Shirley was saying, I always felt like I was both, which is right. We are, right? We're both sheep and goat. We're a mix of things. And so so we strive to be more sheep-like. You know, it's a good point. Any other comments or questions or things you would want to add to this, or connections that you would make to your own life? Okay, then we'll continue on. Final note about community and community's role in this process. Benedict says that there are 4 kinds of monks, right? There are the Cenobites. What's distinguishable about the Cenobites? They live in community, right? He says these are the strong kinds of monks or nuns or monastics, right? Why are they the strong ones? Because it takes a lot to live with other people. But it also takes an awful lot of strength to change and to let other people change who you are, right? Interestingly, the second kind of monk are the hermits or the anchorites. These are the people who live out on their own, right? Now, I've just said that we don't change unless we're around other people who point out who we are, what we need to change, and we're obedient to them. And Benedict makes a place for anchorites, but only what? After the Cenobites, right? You cannot be an anchorite, a healthy one, unless you have lived many years in a monastery, right? And it's not just because you are so good that you no longer have anything to work on. He doesn't really tell us much about the anchorites, but I think the reason that Benedict allows for this in the rare case is because for some people they have internalized their community. They've internalized the rule, and they can start to internalize obedience, right? I know that these are the things that I need to continue working and changing. Then he does something very funny. He tells us about the Cerebaites, which he calls the most detestable kind of monks. I love it. He's like starting to throw shade. But they're so detestable because still loyal to the world by their actions, they clearly lie to God by their tonsure. 2 or 3 together or even alone without a shepherd, their law is what they like to do, whatever strikes their fancy. And anything they believe in and choose, they call holy. Anything they dislike, they call forbidden. Now, what's so bad about the Cerebaite? Well, no, they don't live obedience, right? What Benedict does here is very, very clever. He personifies the vows. That the Cerebaite is the monk who doesn't live obedient. He's only obedient to himself. He's not obedient to a way of life, still loyal to the world by their actions. So he's not, or she's not obedient to the monastic way of life, but to the worldly way of life. They clearly lie to God by their tonsure, 2 or 3 together, or even alone. Their law is what they like to do, right? Without an abbot or without a leader, anything they believe and choose, they're only obedient to themselves. This is what is so, what does he say, detestable about the Cerebaites, as they don't live a life of obedience. And then he tells us about the 4th kind of monk, the gyro of eggs, which are in every way even worse than the Cerebaites. Because what's wrong with the gyro of eggs? If the Cerebaites don't live obedience, the gyro of eggs don't live stability, right? In every way, they're worse, who spend their lives drifting from region to region, always on the move. They never settle down, and they're slaves to their own will and their own gross appetites, right? When someone wants me to change, I'll go somewhere else so that I can continue to be what I want to be, that I continue to do what I want to do until people get tired of me and they want me to change. Bye-bye, I'll go somewhere else. That's the recipe for gyrovigary, if that's the word, right? So Benedict says that the community has to be there for obedience, for stability, if we're going to change. That's why these last 2 monks are so detestable. Sorry. So to summarize, I think that says summarize. The answer to the question, who am I? It's just a summary for us, is fundamental to the Christian life, right? To grow in an understanding of who I am, to know and accept the truth of who I am is necessary before I can truly give myself away, right? True knowledge and possession or acceptance of ourselves is impossible without community. Right? Self-gift and conversion requires a community. Love requires an object. I'll tell you a little funny story. When I was a novice, I have 2 classmates, Father Paul, and Brother Silas. When we were novices, those weren't our names, but one day we were out in an outing and we were talking about different things. And I said, when you like phase out in office, like you're not paying attention, what are you usually thinking about? And Silas said, well, I'm usually like thinking about a saint. I was like, God, I feel terrible about myself. Yeah, I mean, like, I'm usually thinking about things like, I wonder if chocolate would be good on kiwi. Anyway, he's thinking about saints. And I said, what about you, Paul? And he said, well, the other day I was phased out and I was pondering whether love requires an object. Sister Jean is laughing because she knows Paul real well. It makes sense that he would be thinking about this. And I've thought about that ever since. Love does require an object. You can't love unless there is somebody to love, right? Because love is laying down your life for some other. It's willing or the good of the other, but without joining ourselves to some other, a community, a spouse, our children, then there is no opportunity for love, right? So if we want to try to live unattached, then we're likely to become Cerebeites or Gyrovags, but we have to have others in our lives in order to love, right? The community will not only tell us who we are, but they'll also tell us how to be a better, more Christ-like version of ourselves. And so conversion requires the community. Therefore, we must enter into a relationship of loving obedience with some other. I love you enough to obey what you have to say to me, and my obedience will be an expression of love. So we have to enter into a relationship of loving obedience, and then we have to stay put. I'll conclude with one last story. I have this bit of a good friend. She's old enough to be my mother. I have a number of good friends who are women who are old enough to be my mother. I must put out sun vibes or something like that. But anyway, this was a very important friend of mine in my discernment. As I was trying to discern monastic life, she developed cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and I was having supper with her one night, and she said, I'm not really afraid to die. She was an amazing person, and she said, I just realized that now I spend my time more intentionally to do the things that really matter in life. And then she turned to me and she said, so if you want to go to that monastery, you go, because you may not be guaranteed a tomorrow, and we aren't guaranteed unlimited time. And so if you think this is what you want to do it now. It's like, okay. I did it. Well, she came to visit about, like 9 months later. She still comes to visit 2 or 3 times a year. She comes to visit. It's a great support in my vocation. If anything she told me to do, I'd do it. But one time when she visited fairly early on, after about a year or something, I was a little dissatisfied with just the town of St. Meinrad. It wasn't a big deal. I was like, gosh, this town is so dingy. So if I would ever leave, it would maybe because of, and before I could even say like why I might leave, she was like, you stay put. This place is good for you. You are staying. Like, okay, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So anyway, we have to stay put and be obedient to others if we're going to live a life of conversion. Now, I share all of this with you because I think this is not just the monastic life, right? This is the married life. This is any kind of way of life. And I think this is the beauty of Oblates, right? That first of all, hopefully you're studying Benedictine spirituality with us. Teaches you something about what it means to persevere in a marriage in your vocation, or as a single person or as a priest or whatever it is. But don't forget that you all provide a wonderful and incredible witness to us. I've often thought about monastic life as Christianity for dummies. Or remedial Christianity, because if you think of all of the structures that we have in place and the expectations, we have to be at prayer so many times a day. We're surrounded by other people who are trying to do the same thing. We have time carved out in our schedule for Lectio Divina. I figure if you can't succeed at Christianity here, you've got no chance at all. Meanwhile, people who are married and with kids and with so many demands, a couple of jobs and places to get to, for you to continue to put Christ in the center of your lives, it's a huge witness to us and inspiration. And so this mutual witness and you getting closer to us as Oblates is a real gift to us in supporting our vocation, and then hopefully our being able to witness something to you. So I'm sure the sisters feel that way. And so I thank you on their behalf.